Late one stormy night, Officer Daniel Grant sat in his patrol car, the faint buzz of his radio breaking the silence. The rain hammered against the windshield, muting the eerie stillness of the small rural town he patrolled. The shift had been uneventful until a call crackled through his radio, a report of a possible intruder at an abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. The asylum had been shuttered for decades, its history cloaked in rumors of mistreatment, unsanctioned experiments, and ghostly sightings. Locals avoided the place, calling it cursed. Yet here was a report of lights flickering inside. The caller had been a passing truck driver who refused to stop but described shadowy figures moving past the windows. Grant sighed as he drove toward the location, the tires of his cruiser splashing through puddles. He wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. To him, this was likely a group of teenagers trespassing for cheap thrills. Still, as the asylum came into view, he felt a strange unease settle over him. The massive building loomed like a jagged wound against the sky, its windows dark and empty. Yet as he approached, he saw it, a single flickering light in one of the upper floors. He parked the rusted gate, flashlight in hand, and radioed his location. The dispatcher's voice seemed hesitant as she acknowledged, her tone making his unease grow. He pushed open the gate, its screech echoing through the night, and stepped inside. The asylum smelled of mildew and rot. Broken furniture and shattered glass littered the floors, and the air was thick with dampness. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. As Grant moved deeper into the building, his flashlight beam revealed faded murals on the walls, cheerful scenes of children playing, an unsettling contrast to the building's ominous atmosphere. Reaching the staircase, he hesitated. The flickering light was now steady, glowing faintly from the third floor. Taking a deep breath, he ascended, his boots crunching against debris. The sound echoed in the vast emptiness, masking any other noises. At the top of the stairs, the air grew colder. He noticed something odd, footprints in the dust. They were fresh, leading toward the lit room. As he followed them, the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, and the faint hum of voices reached his ears. It wasn't the laughter of teenagers, but low, murmured conversations, as if a group were deliberating just out of sight. Grant rounded the corner to the room and froze. Inside, the single light bulb swung gently from the ceiling, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center. But the footprints ended here, and the voices had stopped. A chill ran down his spine. He stepped closer, inspecting the chair. It was bolted to the floor, restraints dangling from its arms. Rusted medical tools lay scattered around it. As he turned to leave, his flashlight caught something in the corner. Writing scrawled on the wall. It was fresh, the words etched deep into the plaster. "Leave, they watch." The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. His radio crackled, but the voice that came through wasn't dispatch. It was a whisper, distorted but unmistakable. "You're not alone." He spun around, flashlight trembling in his hand, but there was nothing. The room was as empty as before. Grant's instincts screamed at him to leave. He backed into the hallway, heart pounding, and nearly stumbled over something. Looking down, he saw a shoe, small, childlike, its faded fabric soaked from the rain. It hadn't been there when he entered. As he made his way back through the asylum, the voices returned, louder now, following him. Whispers turned to cries, then guttural screams. He didn't stop to investigate. By the time he reached the front door, he was running, the sound of footsteps chasing him until he burst into the night. Outside, the rain had stopped. His cruiser was where he left it, but as he climbed in, he noticed the passenger seat was wet, as if someone had just been sitting there. He whipped around, flashlight in hand, but the back seat was empty. He didn't return to the asylum. In fact, no one ever responded to calls from that location again. The place was quietly removed from the patrol circuit, its stories buried under layers of bureaucratic indifference. But Officer Grant never forgot that night. Sometimes when he sat alone in his car on quiet nights, he could still hear the whispers, faint but persistent, as if they were just waiting for him to return. Officer Sarah Mendoza had worked the graveyard shift for years, patrolling the outskirts of her city. She was used to the odd calls, the eerie quiet of empty streets, and the occasional adrenaline spike when things turned dangerous. But nothing could have prepared her for the call that came in at 2:43 a.m., a night she'd never forget. The call was a disturbance at a remote farmhouse on the edge of town. The voice on the line was distorted, static-filled, but clear enough to make out the urgency. A man claiming someone was in his home. He didn't give his name, just begged for help before the line went dead. When Sarah arrived at the property, the farmhouse was dark and appeared abandoned. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, the windows boarded up in places, others left gaping and shattered. Her headlights illuminated the front door, slightly ajar, swaying in the cold breeze. She stepped out of her cruiser, sans flashlight and hand on her holstered weapon. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that felt alive, oppressive. The radio on her shoulder crackled faintly, but when she tried to check in, the signal was nothing but static. "Dispatch, I'm on scene at the farmhouse. Requesting backup," she said. But there was no response, just silence. Sarah approached the house cautiously, the creak of the wooden porch beneath her boots echoing unnaturally loud. She pushed the door open wider, revealing a dim hallway choked with dust and cobwebs. Her flashlight cut through the darkness, landing on peeling wallpaper and rusted picture frames hung at odd angles. "Police," she called out. "If someone's here, show yourself." A faint sound answered her, almost imperceptible. A soft tapping, like fingernails on wood, coming from the upstairs. The hairs on her arms stood on end. She made her way through the ground floor first. Fins. The living room was empty, except for a moth-eaten couch and a broken rocking chair that swayed gently, as if disturbed moments ago. The kitchen was worse. Rotting food still sat on the counters, and the refrigerator hung open, its interior caked with black mold. The tapping grew louder as she ascended the staircase, each step groaning beneath her weight. At the top, the air felt colder, thinner. Her flashlight beam danced across the hall, landing on doors that stood slightly ajar, as if waiting for her. "Sir, if you can hear me, I'm here to help. Please respond." The tapping stopped. She stood frozen for a moment, heart pounding, before moving toward the first door on her left. Pushing it open with the tip of her flashlight, she revealed a child's bedroom. The wallpaper was faded with cartoon characters, the floor strewn with dusty toys. But what caught her attention was the crib in the corner. It rocked gently, as though something unseen had just left it. A chill ran through her, and she stepped back, bumping into the doorframe. That's when she saw it, scrawled across the far wall in what looked like blackened streaks of soot. "Don't look up." Her breathing quickened, the air around her feeling heavier, suffocating. Against her better judgment, she tilted her head upward. The flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing the ceiling. There was nothing there. Relief washed over her for a split second before a low creaking sound began coming from behind her. She spun around to see the door she had just entered slowly closing on its own. She reached for the knob, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as though someone was holding it from the other side. Then came the whispering. At first, it was a single voice, faint and unintelligible. Then another joined, and another, until it was a cacophony of hushed, urgent tones, rising in volume and surrounding her. She stumbled back, dropping her flashlight. The room plunged into darkness, but she could still see faint shapes moving, their outlines just barely distinguishable from the shadows. A loud thud reverberated through the house, snapping her out of her paralysis. She grabbed the flashlight, its beam flickering as she pointed it toward the door. The whispers stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming up the stairs. She forced the door open and bolted into the hallway. Her flashlight flickered wildly as she descended the stairs, her breaths ragged and uneven. At the bottom, she paused, trying to orient herself, when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The front door, the one she'd entered through, was no longer ajar. It was shut and chained from the inside. The tapping resumed, but this time it wasn't upstairs. It was behind her, in the living room. She turned slowly, the flashlight shaking in her grip, and saw it. A figure, tall and emaciated, crouched in the corner. Its face was obscured by stringy hair, and its limbs were impossibly long, twisted in unnatural angles. It raised a bony hand and tapped its fingernails against the floor, the sound deliberate, mocking. Sarah backed away, reaching for her weapon. The figure tilted its head as though studying her, and then it lunged. She fired twice, the muzzle flashes illuminating the room in harsh bursts. But when the light returned, the figure was gone. The house was silent again, save for the pounding of her heartbeat. She didn't wait to investigate. She sprinted for the back door, finding it unlocked, and burst into the open air. The moment she stepped outside, her radio crackled to life. "Officer Mendoza, do you copy? We lost contact. Are you okay?" She didn't answer. She didn't stop until she was back in her cruiser, speeding away from the farmhouse. When she finally looked in her rearview mirror, she saw the front door of the house was wide open again, swaying gently in the wind. Sarah never spoke of what she saw that night. But every so often, when she was alone in her patrol car, she swore she could hear faint tapping on the windows, as though someone or something was trying to get in. Officer Luke Carter had been working nights in the quiet Appalachian town of Stillwater for nearly a decade. His shifts were usually uneventful, checking on the occasional break-in or breaking up bar fights, but tonight felt different. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds and the air was unnaturally still. At 3:12 a.m., a call came through dispatch. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the other end was shaky, barely audible. Please come. They're outside my house. I think they're watching me. The address was deep in the forested outskirts, a place rarely frequented by locals. Luke grabbed his flashlight, checked his weapon, and headed out. As he drove, the paved roads gave way to dirt trails, and his cruiser's headlights cut through the dense fog hanging in the trees. The dispatcher couldn't reconnect with the caller, and each attempt was met with static. When he arrived, the house stood in the middle of a clearing, its paint peeling and windows dark. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. The front door was slightly ajar. "Stillwater PD? Anyone here?" he called out, stepping onto the creaking porch. There was no response. The house was eerily silent as he entered, the air heavy with the scent of damp wood and decay. Luke's flashlight illuminated a cluttered living room where furniture sat under sheets and dust coated every surface. He called out again, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. Nothing. On the coffee table, he noticed a cordless phone lying on its side. Next to it was a small notebook, open to a page scrawled with frantic handwriting. "They're not human. Don't let them in. Don't look at their faces." A chill ran down his spine as he read the words. He scanned the room again, noticing now that the curtains were drawn tightly over every window. In the corner, a rocking chair swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. Luke moved deeper into the house, his footsteps muffled by the old rotting carpet. The kitchen was cluttered with overturned chairs and shattered plates, as though the owner had left in a hurry. On the refrigerator, a Polaroid photo was stuck with a magnet. It showed a smiling family, a man, a woman, and a young girl standing in front of the house. But something was wrong. The faces of the man and woman were scratched out, leaving only the child's face intact. From somewhere upstairs, a faint creaking noise broke the silence. Luke froze, his hand instinctively resting on his holster. The sound repeated, slow, deliberate, like someone pacing. He climbed the stairs cautiously, each step groaning under his weight. At the top, the hallway stretched into darkness, the doors to the rooms all slightly ajar. The creaking was louder now, coming from the last room on the right. "Stillwater PD," he called out again, his voice firm. "If anyone's here, come out slowly with your hands up." The creaking stopped. Luke moved toward the door, his flashlight trembling slightly. He pushed it open, revealing a bedroom frozen in time. A child's bed sat in the corner, covered in faded floral sheets. Toys were scattered across the floor, and on the wall hung a mirror, its surface cracked and dull. The rocking chair in the corner moved again, this time with a sharp, deliberate creak. Luke swung his flashlight toward it and froze. Someone was sitting in the chair, a small figure, hunched over, their face obscured by long matted hair. They rocked slowly, back and forth, back and forth. "Sir or ma'am, I need you to turn around," Luke said, his voice steady but his heart racing. The figure stopped rocking. Slowly, they began to rise, their movements jerky and unnatural. The hair fell away from their face, and Luke felt his stomach drop. The figure had no eyes. Where they should have been were hollow, dark sockets, and their mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. It raised a hand, bony fingers pointing directly at him. Behind him, a floorboard creaked. Luke spun around, drawing his weapon, but the hallway was empty. When he turned back to the room, the figure in the chair was gone. The rocking chair swayed gently, as though mocking him. The temperature in the room plummeted. His breath came out in visible puffs, and the mirror on the wall began to fog up. As he watched, words appeared on its surface, written by an unseen hand. "They're here." From downstairs, the sound of glass shattering echoed through the house. Luke bolted down the stairs, flashlight swinging wildly. The living room window was broken, the curtains torn. Outside, in the clearing, he saw them. Figures, tall, thin, and inhuman, circled the house. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and they stayed just at the edge of the tree line, where the shadows swallowed their forms. Their faces were wrong, blurry, like a photo out of focus, yet somehow watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. One stepped closer, its head tilting unnaturally to the side. Then another followed, their long limbs moving like broken puppets. Luke didn't wait. He ran to his cruiser, slamming the door shut and starting the engine. The headlights illuminated the clearing, but the figures were gone. He radioed dispatch as he sped back toward town, his voice shaking as he tried to explain what had happened. The line was filled with static, but he swore he heard faint whispering beneath it, a low, guttural voice repeating a single phrase, "Don't look back." Luke didn't. When he returned to the station, his shift commander met him with a frown. "Where were you, Carter? We lost contact for over an hour." He checked his watch. The call had come in less than 30 minutes ago. Luke never went back to the farmhouse, but every now and then, on foggy nights when he patrolled near the woods, he'd catch glimpses of movement in the trees. Shadows too tall and too thin to be human, always just at the edge of his vision, watching, waiting. Officer Nathan Cross thought he had seen everything. A 15-year veteran of the force, he had handled drug busts, homicides, and even the occasional missing persons case. But nothing had prepared him for the call that came through on a November night. The dispatcher sounded shaken, unusual for her calm demeanor. "Nathan, we got a 1066 possible suspicious activity out at Bramblewood Cemetery. Caller didn't leave a name, just said there's someone wandering the grounds. No vehicle, no lights. Said it wasn't human." Nathan sighed, pulling his coat tighter as the chill from outside seemed to seep into the squad room. He wasn't one for ghost stories, but Bramblewood had a reputation. The cemetery dated back to the 1800s and was the subject of countless urban legends. Locals whispered about strange sightings and noises, but nothing concrete. Still, it was his job to check it out. The drive out was quiet, the snow crunching under his tires as he wound through back roads. Bramblewood sat isolated on a hill, its iron gates rusted and twisted. Beyond them, gravestones jutted out of the frozen ground, their inscriptions worn smooth by time. He parked outside the gate, his headlights cutting through the dense fog that seemed to cling to the earth. The air was still, the kind of silence that felt oppressive. He grabbed his flashlight and weapon, radioing his arrival. "Dispatch, this is Cross. I'm at the scene. No sign of movement yet. I'm going in for a look." The gate creaked as he pushed it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he walked deeper into the cemetery, his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows across the graves. The fog seemed to thicken the farther he went, muffling sound and disorienting him. That's when he heard it, a soft, rhythmic crunching like footsteps in the snow. He stopped, holding his breath. The sound stopped too. He turned slowly, shining his flashlight around, but there was nothing there. Just rows of graves and the skeletal branches of trees swaying in the faint breeze. "Hello?" he called out. His voice echoed back to him, hollow and uncertain. The crunching resumed, this time faster, coming from behind him. He spun around, his flashlight catching movement, a figure darting between the headstones, too fast to track. "Stop! Police!" Nathan shouted, drawing his weapon. He moved cautiously toward where he'd seen the figure, his flashlight trembling in his grip. Reaching the spot, he found nothing but disturbed snow, no footprints, no sign of anyone. But then, from somewhere deeper in the cemetery came a sound that chilled him to the bone, a low, guttural laugh. It wasn't human. It was too deep, too resonant, echoing unnaturally in the still night. "Dispatch! I need backup at Bramblewood Cemetery," Nathan said into his radio, his voice tight. But all he got in return was static. The laughter stopped, replaced by a whispering sound, like dozens of voices speaking at once. It seemed to come from every direction, growing louder and more frantic. Nathan's flashlight flickered, the beam cutting in and out as if the batteries were dying, though he had replaced them that morning. Suddenly, the beam settled on a figure standing about 20 feet away. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its face was obscured by the fog, but its head was cocked at an unnatural angle, as though studying him. "Don't move," Nathan shouted, his voice cracking. He aimed his weapon at the figure, but it didn't react. Slowly, it raised one hand and pointed toward a mausoleum at the edge of the cemetery. Nathan hesitated. Every instinct told him to leave, but his feet seemed to move on their own, carrying him toward the mausoleum. The figure didn't follow. It simply stood there, motionless, as if it were part of the fog itself. The mausoleum was old, its stone facade crumbling and its door ajar. A faint light flickered inside, casting strange, shifting shadows. Nathan pushed the door open wider, his flashlight barely penetrating the gloom. Inside, the air was colder, and the walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that looked burned into the stone. At the center of the room was a coffin, its lid pushed slightly aside. The flickering light came from within, a sickly green glow that made his skin crawl. He approached cautiously, every nerve in his body screaming at him to turn back. As he peered into the coffin, he felt his stomach drop. The inside was empty, but the glow came from a series of symbols carved into the wood, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. Behind him, the mausoleum door slammed shut. He whipped around, his flashlight flickering wildly, and the whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. The symbols on the walls seemed to move, twisting and writhing like living things. The figure was there, standing in the corner of the mausoleum, its head now tilted backward at an impossible angle. Its mouth opened wide, wider than any human mouth could, and the whispers turned into a roar. Nathan bolted, slamming his shoulder into the door and bursting back into the cemetery. The fog was thicker now, the gravestones barely visible. He ran toward the gate, the whispers chasing him, growing louder with every step. When he reached his cruiser, he dove inside and locked the doors. The whispers stopped the moment he turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he sped away, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. Back at the station, he tried to report what had happened, but the words stuck in his throat. His hands trembled as he wrote up the incident, leaving out the details that he knew no one would believe. Days later, Nathan returned to Bramblewood Cemetery during the day, this time with a partner. The mausoleum was there, but the symbols were gone, and the coffin sat untouched, its lid sealed. There was no sign of the figure, no evidence of what had happened that night. But Nathan knew. And every so often when he was alone at night, he would hear faint whispers, as though something had followed him back. Something that wasn't finished with him yet. Officer Jamie Brooks had always dismissed ghost stories as nonsense. He prided himself on being grounded in reality, facts, evidence, logic. But that conviction was tested one frigid December night when he responded to a call at the old Holloway orphanage on the outskirts of town. The orphanage had been abandoned for decades, its hulking stone structure a magnet for urban explorers and thrill seekers. Stories of strange occurrences, sightings of children's shadows, distant laughter echoing through the halls were local lore. Jamie had laughed off those tales more than once, but when a security guard reported lights flickering inside and faint voices echoing from the second floor, Jamie was dispatched to investigate. The orphanage loomed large as he pulled up, his cruiser's headlights barely illuminating the cracked stone facade. Snow fell in heavy, wet flakes, muffling the world around him. The main doors were chained shut, but the security guard had mentioned a side entrance left ajar. "Dispatch, I'm at the Holloway orphanage," Jamie said into his radio, stepping out into the cold. His breath puffed in the freezing air, going in to check for trespassers. The side door groaned as he pushed it open, the sound echoing unnaturally in the dark. Inside, the air was colder than outside, heavy with the smell of mildew and decay. His flashlight beam danced across peeling wallpaper, shattered glass, and broken furniture. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. "Police," Jamie called out, his voice firm. "If anyone's here, come out now." The only response was the faint drip of water somewhere deeper inside. He made his way down the main hall, his boots crunching on debris. At the end of the corridor was a staircase leading to the second floor. The security guard had specifically mentioned hearing noises from up there, children's laughter, soft but unmistakable. Jamie hesitated at the base of the stairs. For the first time in his career, he felt a sliver of doubt creep in. But he shook it off and began to climb. Each step groaned under his weight, and the darkness seemed to thicken the higher he went. The second floor was worse. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. His flashlight illuminated rows of dormitory-style rooms, their doors hanging off their hinges. Faint, faded murals of animals and smiling suns adorned the walls, a sad reminder of the building's past. "Hello?" he called out again, his voice faltering slightly. The silence pressed in, but then from somewhere down the hall came the sound of a ball bouncing, a rhythmic thump, 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 slow and deliberate. Jamie's stomach tightened. He followed the sound, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The noise led him to a room at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. Inside, the beam of his light revealed a small, dusty rubber ball rolling slowly to a stop in the center of the floor. "Who's there?" Jamie demanded, stepping into the room. The temperature dropped sharply, his breath now visible in thick clouds. He scanned the room, but it was empty. Then, behind him, a giggle. High-pitched, unmistakably a child's. Jamie spun around, his flashlight cutting through the dark. The hallway was empty. His radio crackled, startling him. A faint voice came through, garbled and full of static, but it sounded like a child whispering, "Help us." "Dispatch?" Jamie said, his voice tight. "Repeat that, I didn't catch." The radio cut out completely, leaving only silence. That's when he heard it, a soft rustling, like small feet shuffling across the floor, coming from one of the nearby rooms. He followed the sound, pushing open the door. The room was small, with rows of tiny cots lining the walls. His flashlight caught movement, a shadow darting across the far end of the room. But there was nothing there. The giggle came again, this time right behind him. Jamie turned, his pulse pounding, but the room was empty. That's when he noticed the cots. They had been covered in dust when he entered, but now, faint impressions of small bodies pressed into the blankets, as if children were lying there. The door slammed shut behind him. Jamie bolted, wrenching the door open and running back into the hall. The air was alive now, filled with whispers and giggles, faint cries, and the soft patter of footsteps. The building seemed to pulse around him, the walls closing in. As he reached the stairs, his flashlight flickered and died. He stumbled down the steps in darkness, the sounds of laughter and crying growing louder, surrounding him. He reached the main door, pulling at the chain until it snapped, and burst out into the cold night air. Outside, the world was silent again. The whispers and giggles stopped the moment he crossed the threshold. His cruiser sat where he'd left it, a beacon of safety in the otherwise desolate landscape. But as he opened the door and climbed in, he froze. In the rearview mirror, he saw them. A row of children stood at the orphanage's windows, their faces pale and eyes hollow. They didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. Jamie didn't look back as he sped away, his hands shaking on the wheel. He filed his report that night, leaving out the details no one would believe. But he knew what he had seen. And every so often, on quiet nights when he patrolled the outskirts of town, he swore he could still hear faint laughter echoing through his radio, as if the children of Holloway Orphanage were calling him back. The call came in just after midnight. Officer Daniel Hayes, working the night shift in the small town of Coldwater, wasn't expecting much. It was usually a quiet town, but the dispatcher's voice sounded unusually tense. "Daniel, we got a call from the old Morgan farmhouse," she said. Caller hung up before I could get any details. Neighbors reported seeing lights in the windows. Daniel frowned. The Morgan farmhouse had been abandoned for nearly 20 years after a family of 5 mysteriously disappeared. Over the years, it had become a local haunt for teenagers looking for a scare. He assumed it was another prank or some kids fooling around. "I'm on it," Daniel replied, grabbing his flashlight and heading out. The drive to the farmhouse took him down winding roads, the kind where the headlights barely pierced the darkness. The house came into view, a decaying structure standing alone in an overgrown field. Its broken shutters and sagging roof made it look like it was sinking into the earth. Daniel parked his cruiser at the edge of the property, the gravel crunching loudly in the stillness. The air was heavy, almost suffocating as he approached the house. He noticed faint light flickering behind the grimy windows, just as the dispatcher had mentioned. "Coldwater PD," Daniel called out as he stepped onto the creaking porch. His voice seemed to vanish into the stillness. He pushed the front door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The inside was worse than he expected. The air was damp, filled with the smell of rot and mildew. His flashlight swept across broken furniture, peeling wallpaper and debris scattered across the floor. But there was something else. The faint scent of smoke, as if a candle had recently been extinguished. "Hello?" He called again, his voice echoing through the empty house. No response. As he moved deeper into the house, he noticed strange symbols scratched into the walls, crude and jagged. They looked hastily drawn, but they weren't graffiti. There was something unsettling about them, as if they pulsed faintly when he stared too long. The flickering light was coming from upstairs. Daniel hesitated at the base of the staircase, his flashlight beam trembling. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced behind him, but the shadows were still. The stairs groaned under his weight as he climbed. The second floor was colder, the air thick with the smell of burning wax. At the end of the hallway, he saw it, a single door slightly ajar, golden light spilling out. "Coldwater PD," he called out, his voice firm but edged with unease. He approached the door, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Pushing it open, he froze. Inside, the room was lit by dozens of candles arranged in a circle. In the center stood an old, ornate mirror, its surface covered in dark smudges. The symbols from downstairs were carved into the floor around the mirror, and the air hummed with an unsettling energy. Daniel's flashlight flickered as he stepped into the room. The mirror seemed to pull his gaze, the smudges on its surface shifting as if alive. He reached out to touch it, his hand trembling, when a sound stopped him cold. A whisper, soft, urgent, coming from the mirror itself. "Help us." He yanked his hand back, stumbling away from the mirror. The whisper grew louder, joined by others, dozens of voices overlapping, pleading, crying. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, and for a moment, Daniel swore he saw faces, pale, terrified, their mouths open in silent screams. Suddenly, the candles went out, plunging the room into darkness. Daniel's flashlight flickered wildly before going out completely. He drew his weapon, backing toward the door, but it slammed shut before he could reach it. The whispers turned into guttural growls, filling the room. Something heavy scraped across the floor behind him. He spun around, firing his weapon, but the muzzle flash revealed nothing but emptiness. The growls grew louder, closer, circling him. In the darkness, a figure emerged, a woman, gaunt and pale, her eyes sunken in black. She moved unnaturally, her limbs jerking like a puppet. Her mouth opened impossibly wide, and the whispers and growls stopped. Silence. Then, in a voice that echoed inside his head, she said, "You shouldn't have come." Daniel felt something icy close around his wrist, yanking him toward the mirror. He struggled, but the pull was too strong. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't right. Its eyes were hollow, its expression twisted into a cruel grin. The last thing he saw before the mirror swallowed him was his own reflection mouthing the words, "Now you're ours." The next morning, Daniel's cruiser was found parked at the edge of the Morgan property, the engine still running. The farmhouse was empty, the candles gone, the symbols faded. His flashlight lay abandoned in the upstairs hallway. Officer Daniel Hayes was never seen again. Locals say that on cold, quiet nights, if you stand outside the Morgan farmhouse, you can hear faint whispers coming from the second floor. They're always calling for help. The call came at 2:47 a.m., jolting Officer Sarah Clemens awake from a light nap at her desk. She was the only officer on duty in the small, remote town of Pine Hollow that night. The voice on the other end of the line was shaky and barely audible. "There's someone in my house," the woman whispered. "They're in the basement." Sarah immediately sat up, adrenaline replacing the grogginess. She grabbed her notepad. "Ma'am, what's your address?" The woman hesitated. It's 42 Mill Creek Road." Her voice broke. "Please hurry." Sarah recognized the address. It was the old Harrington house, long thought to be abandoned. Locals claimed the place was haunted after the Harrington family vanished 50 years ago, leaving the house to rot. Sarah had driven past it countless times, but she had never had a reason to stop. Until now. "I'm on my way," Sarah said, grabbing her flashlight and weapon. As she drove through the deserted streets, her radio crackled with static, a faint, garbled voice whispering something unintelligible. She shook her head, chalking it up to bad reception. The Harrington house was even creepier at night. It sat at the end of a long, overgrown driveway, its windows black and empty. The front porch sagged under the weight of years, and the entire structure seemed to lean toward her as she approached. Sarah parked her cruiser and radioed in. Dispatch, I'm at 42 Mill Creek Road, checking for a possible intruder. Static greeted her again. She frowned, double-checked the frequency, and tried again. Still nothing. The silence felt oppressive, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Her flashlight cut through the darkness as she stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under her boots. The front door was unlocked, swinging open slightly with a soft creak. "Police!" Sarah called out as she entered. The air inside was heavy with dust and mildew. Cobwebs draped across the ceiling and broken furniture littered the floor. "Ma'am, are you here?" The only response was the faint sound of something scraping against wood. It was coming from below her, the basement. Sarah followed the sound, her flashlight beam trembling slightly. The basement door was ajar, revealing a staircase descending into pitch-black darkness. She hesitated. Her training told her to wait for backup, but backup was hours away in a town this small. The scraping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. "Ma'am," she called out, stepping onto the first creaky stair. "I'm coming down. Stay where you are." Her flashlight barely penetrated the darkness below. The air grew colder as she descended, each step echoing unnaturally. The scraping grew louder, accompanied by a faint, wet squelching sound that made her stomach churn. At the bottom of the stairs, the beam of her flashlight landed on a long, narrow hallway. The walls were lined with peeling plaster, and the floor was dirt, uneven and damp. The sound was coming from the far end. Sarah moved cautiously, her heart pounding. "Police, show yourself!" She reached the end of the hallway and found a door. It was slightly open, light spilling through the crack. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open. The room was small and cold, with a single dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the center was a wooden table. On it, an old tape recorder played a looping sound, a metallic scraping that filled the room. But the tape recorder wasn't the most horrifying thing. The walls were covered in writing, carved deep into the wood with what looked like fingernails. Over and over, the same phrase, "They're watching." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. The scraping noise stopped, replaced by a soft whispering that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Get out!" the voices hissed. "You shouldn't be here." Her flashlight flickered, and for a moment the carvings on the wall seemed to shift, as if they were writhing. Then she saw it. A figure standing in the corner of the room, facing the wall. Its silhouette was gaunt and impossibly tall, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Ma'am?" Sarah stammered, raising her weapon. "Turn around! Hands where I can see them." The figure didn't move. The whispers grew louder, filling her head, overlapping and urgent. She took a step forward, and the figure began to turn, slowly, jerkily, its limbs moving as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. When the face came into view, Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. The figure's eyes were hollow, its mouth stretched wide into an inhuman grin. It raised one long, bony finger and pointed past her. Sarah spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway. When she turned back, the room was empty. The figure was gone, and so was the tape recorder. The walls were blank, the carvings erased as if they'd never been there. Her flashlight flickered again, and she bolted up the stairs, her boots slipping on the dirt. She didn't stop until she was outside, gasping for air in the cold night. Her cruiser was gone. Sarah froze, scanning the driveway, but there were no tire tracks in the dirt, no sign it had ever been there. Her radio crackled to life, the static hissing faintly. Then came a voice, her own voice, shaky and distant. "Ma'am, are you here?" it repeated, echoing her words from earlier. Sarah didn't wait to hear more. She ran down the driveway, the whispers following her, growing louder until they seemed to surround her. She never made it back to town. The next morning, her cruiser was found parked outside the Harrington house, its lights still on. The basement door was wide open, and her flashlight lay at the bottom of the stairs, flickering weakly. Sarah Clemens was never seen again. But the townsfolk say if you drive past the Harrington house late at night, you can see a figure standing in the upstairs window, watching. Always watching. It was a dreary October night when Officer Liam Grayson was dispatched to investigate a 911 call from one of the town's oldest cemeteries, Maplewood Rest. The caller had whispered one word, "help," before the line went dead. Dispatch had tried calling back, but there was no response. Probably just a prank, Liam muttered to himself as he drove down the winding road toward the cemetery. But the call had come from inside the cemetery itself, and protocol demanded he check it out. Maplewood Rest was notorious among the locals. The graves dated back to the 1800s, and legends of restless spirits and strange occurrences had turned it into a hot spot for ghost hunters and thrill seekers. Liam had always thought the stories were just that, stories. But something about the silence that night felt wrong. He parked his cruiser outside the wrought iron gates, his headlights illuminating the weathered tombstones that stretched into the distance. A thick fog clung to the ground, swirling around his boots as he stepped out. "Dispatch, I'm at Maplewood Rest," he said into his radio. "No sign of anyone yet. I'll check the area." Static crackled in response, followed by faint whispers. He frowned, adjusting the volume. "Dispatch? Repeat that?" The static hissed, and for a brief moment he thought he heard someone breathing. Brushing it off, Liam entered the cemetery. The air was damp and cold, carrying the earthy smell of decaying leaves. His flashlight beams swept over the graves, casting long, eerie shadows. "Hello?" he called out. "This is the police. Is anyone here?" Silence. Then a faint sound, a soft thud from somewhere deeper inside the cemetery. It was rhythmic, almost like someone digging. He followed the noise, his flashlight cutting through the fog. The sound grew louder as he approached an old mausoleum, its stone facade cracked and covered in moss. The door was slightly ajar. Liam hesitated. The logical part of his brain told him to call for backup, but curiosity, or maybe pride, pushed him forward. He drew his weapon and nudged the door open with his foot. Inside, the mausoleum was colder than outside. The air was stale, and his flashlight revealed rows of stone slabs, each bearing a name and date. The thudding sound was louder now, echoing off the walls. It was coming from below. He spotted a narrow staircase at the back of the mausoleum, leading down into the earth. His grip tightened on his flashlight as he descended, the steps creaking under his weight. The basement was cramped and dark, the air thick and oppressive. The thudding stopped as soon as he reached the bottom. His flashlight beam swept across the room, landing on an open coffin in the center. It was empty. Something moved behind him, a faint shuffle of feet. He spun around, but the room was empty. His flashlight flickered, and for a moment he thought he saw a shadow dart across the far wall. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice echoing. "Come out now." The silence was deafening. Then, a whisper, so close it felt like it was right next to his ear. "You shouldn't be here." Liam turned, his heart pounding. The open coffin was no longer empty. Inside lay a body, a man in a tattered suit, his skin pale and waxy, his eyes wide open. Liam stumbled back, but when he looked again, the coffin was empty once more. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. They were chanting something he couldn't understand, a language that made his skin crawl. He backed toward the stairs, his flashlight flickering wildly. But when he turned to climb, the stairs were gone. In their place was solid stone. Panic set in. He spun around, looking for another way out, but the room seemed to shift and close in on itself. The whispers turned into guttural growls, and the air grew icy. Shadows danced across the walls, moving closer, surrounding him. "Dispatch!" he yelled into his radio. "I'm trapped in the mausoleum basement. Need assistance now." The radio crackled with static. Then a voice. "Leave, if you can." His flashlight went out. The last thing he remembered was the feeling of hands, cold, skeletal hands, grasping his arms that pulling him toward the open coffin. He screamed, but the darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, Liam's cruiser was found parked outside the cemetery gates, its engine still running. The mausoleum door was locked tight, and despite hours of searching, there was no sign of him. Local legend now tells of a new figure haunting Maplewood Rest, a lone officer wandering the graves, his flashlight flickering in the fog. Some say if you call out to him, he'll turn to you, his face pale and twisted, and whisper, "You shouldn't be here." Officer Rachel Morgan had been working the night shift for years, and in her small rural town, the calls were usually mundane. But the call she received that night would change everything. 911, what's your emergency?" she asked, her voice calm. There was a pause, then a faint, trembling voice. "They're in the walls." Rachel frowned. "Who's in the walls, ma'am? Are you in danger?" The woman on the other end didn't answer directly. "They watch me all the time. I hear them at night." Her voice broke into a sob. "Please, come to 18 Willow Lane. They're everywhere." Rachel tried to get more information, but the line went dead. Willow Lane was a quiet street on the edge of town. The house in question, an old Victorian, had a reputation. Its previous owners had abandoned it years ago, leaving it to rot. Some claimed it was cursed. Others said it was haunted. Rachel didn't believe in any of that. She was a realist. She arrived to find the house in complete darkness, its peeling paint and sagging roof adding to its ominous presence. Her patrol car's headlights swept over the front porch as she radioed in. "Dispatch, I'm at 18 Willow Lane. Investigating a possible intruder," she said. The radio hissed with static, and she thought she heard a faint voice, but it was too garbled to understand. Steeling herself, Rachel approached the house. The front door was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. "Police!" she called out. "I'm here to help. If anyone's inside, make yourself known." The only response was the creak of the door as it swung wider. She stepped inside, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was thick and musty, the smell of damp wood and decay overwhelming. Cobwebs hung like curtains, and the floors groaned under her boots. "Hello? Is anyone here?" she called again. Somewhere upstairs, a soft thump, then another. Rachel's hand instinctively went to her weapon. "Police, stay where you are." She moved toward the staircase, the beam of her flashlight flickering slightly. The thumping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, as though someone or something was moving from room to room. When she reached the top of the stairs, the sound stopped. She swept her flashlight down the dark hallway. The walls were covered in strange scratches, lines and symbols that didn't look random. They seemed deliberate. The air was colder here, and the silence pressed against her ears. From the far end of the hallway came a faint whisper. "Help! Me!" Rachel's stomach tightened. She moved cautiously toward the sound, her flashlight shaking in her grip. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, leading her to a door at the very end of the hall. She pushed it open. The room was empty, save for an old, broken rocking chair in the corner. The walls were covered in deep gouges, just as though something had clawed at them repeatedly. Her flashlight caught something glinting on the floor, a small, tarnished locket. She bent down to pick it up. The instant her fingers touched it, the rocking chair creaked. Slowly, it began to move, rocking back and forth, though there was no one in it. Rachel's breath caught. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The whispering returned, now all around her, overlapping voices that seemed to come from inside the walls. She backed away, her flashlight darting wildly. The walls began to groan, the gouges in the wood seeming to deepen as the whispers grew louder. Then, from behind her, a voice, clear and close. "They're inside you." Rachel spun around, but the hallway was empty. The air felt electric, charged with something she couldn't explain. The whispers turned to laughter, childlike, mocking, echoing in the confined space. She stumbled backward, her back hitting the wall. The wall gave way. She fell into darkness, landing hard on a dirt floor. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Her flashlight flickered, barely illuminating the space around her. She was in some kind of crawl space, narrow and claustrophobic, the walls pressing in on either side. Then she saw them. Faces, dozens of them, pale and sunken, their hollow eyes staring out from the walls. Their mouths moved silently, as though screaming, but no sound came out. The walls themselves seemed alive, shifting and writhing as the faces pushed forward. Rachel scrambled to her feet, her flashlight clattering to the ground. She ran, her breaths coming in panicked gasps, but the crawl space seemed to stretch endlessly. The faces followed her, their mouths opening wider, their silent screams filling her head. She tripped, falling hard onto the dirt. When she looked up, there was a figure standing in front of her, a woman, gaunt and gray, her eyes black pits. She tilted her head, her mouth curling into an unnatural smile. "They've been waiting for you," the woman whispered, her voice echoing inside Rachel's skull. The flashlight went out. The next morning, Rachel's patrol car was found parked outside the house, its door open. Her radio was still on, crackling with faint static. Inside the house, there was no sign of her. The only clue was a small, tarnished locket lying in the hallway. Its chain snapped. Locals now avoid 18 Willow Lane entirely. They say if you walk by late at night, you can hear whispers coming from the walls and the faint sound of a rocking chair creaking upstairs. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you might hear a voice calling for help. But no one who goes inside ever comes back. It was just past 3 a.m. when Officer Ethan Connors received the call. The voice on the line was frantic, a man claiming that someone or something was trying to get into his house. "It's not human," the man had whispered. "Its eyes, they're wrong." Ethan tried to ask more questions, but the line went dead. The address came through seconds later. 16 Briarwood Lane, a house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods. It was a place people rarely went unless they had to. Ethan couldn't shake the unease that crept into his chest as he drove through the empty streets toward the isolated property. When he arrived, the house was in complete darkness. The wind howled through the trees, making the old wooden shutters rattle. The driveway was empty, no cars, no signs of life. Ethan parked his cruiser and approached the front door, flashlight in one hand, the other resting on his holstered weapon. He knocked, the sound echoing unnaturally in the still night. "Police! Is anyone home?" No answer. He tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. The air inside was thick with an overwhelming stench, something metallic mixed with rot. Ethan gagged, pulling his flashlight up to scan the entryway. The furniture was overturned, claw marks gouged into the walls and floors. Papers and shattered glass littered the ground. "Hello?" Ethan called, stepping further inside. "This is the police. If anyone's here, make yourself known." A noise upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. He drew his weapon and started up the staircase, each creak of the old wood feeling like thunder in the silence. The hallway at the top of the stairs was narrow, lined with doors. The footsteps stopped. A single door at the end of the hall was ajar, faint light spilling from the gap. Ethan tightened his grip on his flashlight and approached, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He nudged the door open with his foot. The room was empty, save for a single chair sitting in the center, facing the wall. On the chair was a strange object, a wooden box covered in carvings of symbols Ethan didn't recognize. They seemed to twist and shift in the dim light as though alive. On the wall in front of the chair, written in what looked like blood, were the words, "Don't look into its eyes." The words sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He backed away from the chair, suddenly feeling as though he was being watched. A sound behind him, a low, guttural growl. Ethan spun around, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. At the far end of the hallway, something was standing in the shadows. Its outline was human, but its limbs were too long, its posture hunched and unnatural. "Stay where you are," Ethan shouted, his voice shaking. "I'm armed." The figure didn't move. Then, slowly, it stepped into the light. Its face wasn't right. The features were too sharp, the skin stretched taut over the bones. But it was the eyes that froze Ethan in place, large and reflective, like a predator's, glowing faintly in the dark. They locked onto his, and he felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him, like the weight of something ancient and malevolent pressing down on his soul. The figure smiled, its lips pulling back to reveal rows of jagged teeth. It began to move toward him, its steps slow and deliberate. Ethan raised his weapon, his finger trembling on the trigger. "Don't come any closer," he barked. The creature stopped, tilting its head as though studying him. Then it spoke, its voice low and guttural, like the sound of rocks grinding together. "You shouldn't have come here." The light in the hallway flickered, and in that split second of darkness, the creature vanished. Ethan's flashlight stuttered back on, but the hallway was empty. Panicking, he stumbled back down the stairs, his radio crackling to life. "Dispatch, I need backup at 16 Briarwood Lane," he gasped. "There's something." His voice caught in his throat as he reached the front door. It was no longer open. The entire house seemed different now, the walls closer, the air colder. The claw marks were gone, replaced with new carvings, symbols like the ones on the box upstairs, etched deep into the wood. The door wouldn't budge, no matter how hard he pulled. Behind him, the growling returned, louder this time, and closer. He spun around, but the flashlight in his hand sputtered and died. In the pitch-black silence, he could feel it, something breathing right behind him. The next morning, Ethan's cruiser was found parked outside 16 Briarwood Lane, its lights still on. The house itself looked untouched, as though no one had been there in years. The backup officers who arrived found no sign of Ethan inside. The only clue was a message carved into the wood of the front door. "It sees you." To this day, officers in the area avoid Briarwood Lane, and the house remains abandoned. But locals whisper that on quiet nights, if you pass by the property, you can see faint lights flickering in the windows, and a pair of glowing eyes watching you from the darkness.